So this is the session on AI governance from the trenches, solving AI governance challenges. We have an excellent panel. I'll introduce them in a moment here. My name is Nishant, Bhajaria. I'm written the book Data Privacy, a book for engineers. And this session is going to be about how we use governance and AI together in this fast-changing space. So without further delay, I'll hand it off to my panelists to introduce themselves. John, you want to go first, John?
Yeah, sure. Hi, I'm John Adams, Senior Director within the legal team at LinkedIn. I focus on AI governance and AI compliance for LinkedIn. Just a usual caveat that I'm speaking on my personal capacity and not on behalf of LinkedIn or any of its affiliates. I'll pass it over to you, Barbara.
Hi, good morning. I'm Barbara Sondag. I'm the Senior Associate General Counsel at Intuit, and I lead our data governance team within the legal function. And also similar to what John just said, I'm speaking in my own capacity, and these do not represent the opinions of Intuit. Over to you, Shoshana.
Thank you. I'll lead with that. So I'm at WSP USA, and everything I say is on my own behalf and in my own opinions, and not on behalf of WSP USA. I lead AI governance and as the Chief Privacy Officer there at WSP USA, and we also advise clients. So experiences come through more than simply having built out that program.
Henri?
Okay, and thank you. My name is Henri. I'm the head of privacy by design at Vodafone and also leading the responsible AI program at Vodafone and Vodafone Group side. And also from my own side, I will provide my opinions from as a personal capacity, not in the opinions of Vodafone as well. Back to you, Nishant.
Thank you also. I'll just jump right in. So everywhere I go, people have to say three things in a sentence: a noun, a verb, and Gen AI. It's like if you can't discuss Gen AI, apparently you're not cool anymore. So I'll ask my panel to tell me and the audience, what do you mean by AI governance when it comes to the world we live in? That phrase has many definitions, but I'd love for the audience to understand from you guys. When folks say AI governance, what does that mean? I'll ask Shoshana first. Go first.
Okay, so mine might differ slightly. So
I hope so.
I'm very strongly of the mind and believe that the impacts of AI on an organization that require monitoring and governance far exceed compliance. They far exceed legal, right? This has an impact on where your data is going as our security perimeter hardens around the tools that our employees want that we don't give them. It has an impact on where your employees are going, whether or not you're keeping up and giving them not just minimum de minimis literacy, but also the ability to upskill. It has an impact on your clients, on your standing in the competitive marketplace, and on your own internal appetite for risk and innovation. So AI governance, the approach that I take is a holistic approach, which actually understands that it doesn't sit in a corner, and it's an organizational program that allows for continuous monitoring across all those vectors.
That was great. Barbara, Barbara?
Yeah, actually, Shoshana and I would agree a lot with what she said. I think that AI governance is indeed, it is more of a holistic function. It does not sit in one corner of the organization. And it is really something that should be looked at from an end-to-end process, right? From the moment when, the data that's being considered to be put into the models, really, and looking at that development and the outputs and the requirements that are being put around that as a framework, the committee that's going to govern that and create guardrails, rules, et cetera, for the system, right? So it's a really a larger part of our organization where you have many teams joining in to meet those requirements. Over to you, Henri.
Yeah, thank you. In addition with what you already said, I think that in my mind, AI governance is also more of a transformational program because it's not something you can just do like once, but it is something that you need to establish more as a culture. So to me, responsible AI itself, if we think that responsible AI is more like the practices and principles, then they need to be more considered as a culture and they need to be adopted as something that are part of the development lifecycle end to end. So again, to me, part of this, like how to make responsible AI and AI governance live in the practical side is to actually try to embed those practices into the team's own ways of working. It's not something coming from outside, but something that they embed themselves and integrate and therefore live through the practice as well as a culture. And then the second point I would add is that I think that we can also try to see AI as something that we can use to govern AI as well, because there are so many AI innovations out there that can also lend their hand into AI governance context as well.
This is where I love the coverage. John, next.
Yeah, I just wanted to throw just a little bit out there as well. I mean, I think that's all. I think all those points are great. The one thing I would also flag, right, is that, when we're thinking about AI governance, it's, as Shoshana said, right, it's not just compliance, it's ethics, it's how we do things. It's a cultural thing, to Henri's point. I do think that one thing that's a particular challenge, of course, and maybe this is segueing into a different question, right? But one thing that's a particular challenge is because it is so omnipresent throughout an organization, so many different stakeholders involved. One of the, I think, most critical issues in AI governance is ensuring that there is a strong, leadership aspect to it, to ensure that people stay coordinated, that they stay in the same culture, that it stays part of the sort of coordinated, holistic approach to AI governance, because you could easily have teams thinking that they understand what AI governance is and going different directions as a result.
I love John's question. It takes me into sort of the next area of thinking. So when you go back the last 20 years, security was brought incident response in the beginning, like something that was going to happen, let's fix it, let's stop it. Privacy began as compliance, with GDPR sort of hovering over us once the privacy shield disappeared. With AI governance, we get a chance to do it right from the very beginning. So we have the opportunity to take everything we have learned with security, privacy over the last 2 decades. Given that, what should the audience watch for? Like, what have you learned over the last 2 or 3 years as GenAI has gotten bigger? Like, what lessons, what difficulties, what victories can you say this is something you can take and make your own for the audience that's listening right now? So I'll go to Henri first.
Yeah, thank you. So what we basically did is that, of course, like already said in the beginning, so corral your forces and basically create your own program as well to then manage these practices. But also, in my mind, it's important to basically know what you have in place and where you can actually make use of the existing practices or existing solutions or existing processes to then embed those AI components into those where possible. So we looked into also existing processes and technology solutions that as well, that where we can integrate topics so that it doesn't become, again, as said, a standalone thing, but something that is part of the day-to-day ways of working. And same for the development teams as well. So we also looked into how to integrate practices into the development lifecycle, and also what we can offer as a solution to the teams themselves so that they can basically make use of existing capabilities instead of creating something standalone or separate. So those are some of the elements we looked into as to how to integrate these practices better into the existing ways of working.
Thank you. Shoshana?
So I would say I think the idea that we sort of got it from the beginning is pretty funny when we think about how these systems were built with everything on the internet, right? So we were already, even the regulations are sort of stop the bleeding, right? So it's a nice notion, but understanding where you are, I think I agree absolutely with Henri, but I will say, I do think you always want to make it as easy on the organization as possible and to understand what's in place in terms of laws, in terms of processes. But I think it's important to carve out the parts that are distinct. And I do think that AI governance is not, as I mentioned, I don't think it sits with one person. I think you have an oversight or a governance body, even if it's made up of your risk committee that dealt with things prior. There's a lot of training that needs to go into that level of leadership that's going to have that oversight. There is a lot of distinction to this function because, again, you are trying to, as an organization, understand, I'm going to say it this way, like who you are with regard to AI, which is often very different than who you are aiming at being or intending or plan to be, right? And so taking those aspects and pulling them together, I do think there's a distinct component. But again, building everything in as best you can, I absolutely agree to embed it at every layer.
So I'll just take a quick segue here for the audience. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A tab. We'd love to answer them as we go forward. But John, over to you. The same question.
Yeah, it's a great question. I was going to say what Shoshana said, right, which is the idea that we're kind of jumping in at the start is, I think, not quite accurate. I mean, I think it's actually, we're jumping in a few years after generative AI really kind of got everybody's attention. But I mean, people have been dealing with AI governance challenges for a couple decades at this point, right? I mean, you look at major companies and they've had responsible AI programs dating back to, 2016 and times like that. But I think in the present age, I mean, I think one thing we have to keep in mind, right, is that everything is moving so fast. If you pay attention to the AI landscape, it's constantly evolving. The challenges are constantly changing. The legal landscape is constantly changing. the questions coming out of the AI Act and its implementation guidance are constantly evolving. I mean, just over the past week, we've seen new regulatory documents coming from the European Commission. And so it's an area where, yeah, we are building the planes, we're flying it, but the thing is we've already been flying it and we're kind of over the middle of the ocean right now. And so, to the point that Henri and Shoshana were making earlier, we really do have to leverage existing frameworks. If you're already doing data mapping exercises for data processing, which you probably should be, great. You can also use that for your data mapping for AI, for training general purpose AI models, for example. And so there's a lot of ways you can drive efficiencies, but it's still a lot of work, and it is a new field, but I think it is really kind of a hybrid field. It's like if you take like a Thanksgiving dinner, for example, and you have individual dishes of turkey and green beans and other things. Well, AI governance is kind of like the casserole you make with all the leftover parts, right? It has little constituent pieces of everything kind of baked into it. So I'll leave you with that tasty analogy in the morning.
Barbara?
Now I'm going to be thinking about Thanksgiving dinner. I thought about this. It's probably easier for brand new organizations or companies right from the start. If to answer Nishant's question, then they can come at this fresh. We have no data, and we can build however we want to build. But when you are an older company that has data, from years back, then it's really a much larger lift to think about, how can we incorporate a brand new framework and lay that on top of, or, to integrate as best as you can into all of the parts of our organization. And so, in our organization, where it's 40 plus years old, that was an enormous challenge, but it was something where we had the buy-in from leadership from day one, really just announcing to everyone that is really the top priority, and having that mindset that we are going to really make that the top priority was so helpful, so that we can really just get the velocity, the attention that was needed to really prioritize that work and to build out a larger sort of operating system, if you will, like as that, that framework that would integrate across the company.
It's great. Thank you. Those were great answers. So one thing that comes to mind when I think about privacy and AI governance is for privacy, it often became very theoretical for many companies, a very compliance focused checkboxy approach. And for other stuff like security, it often became mission creep, where let's encrypt everything, like let's have a very robust key management system. So you have this danger where on the one side you do the bare minimum, or on the other side you make it never ending. So when you think about AI governance across your companies, how do you prevent either extreme? How do you make sure that you are there to do the efficient AI that we all care about? How do you also make sure that this doesn't become a drag for productivity? Because every engineer out there is looking at their OKRs and they see people like us and they get a little scared. So how do you avoid either extreme? John, I see you smiling.
Yeah, I'm smiling because I'm going to be listening to everybody else's answers to try to find out how do we do that, right? It's hard. If you have engineers who are working at breakneck speed, trying to do cutting edge work, they are working really, really hard and doing things really, really fast, and keeping the governance up to speed with what they are doing and what they're trying to accomplish is a meaningful challenge, right? And to the points we were making earlier, the AI landscape is changing so quickly. What you might have said to an engineering team when they wanted to do some experimentation with like a GPT API, for example, right? Then they wanted to get access to a llama model, and now they want to use a DeepSeek reasoning model, and they want to do fine tuning on top of that, and it it's just happening so quickly. And so one of the things that I view very helpful is like understanding what the engineers are motivated by, and that helps directionally set your course, but also leaning into engineering best practices, right? So one thing that I found very helpful is that engineers do care a lot about craftsmanship. They do care a lot about doing things right in a reproducible way. A lot of the work that we do in AI governance is around documentation, it's around process, right? And to the extent that you can bake your documentation efforts, your process efforts into their existing engineering practices, so that when they are, extracting training data sets, they're documenting what's being extracted. If you can build tooling to do that in an automated manner, like if your organization is training or fine tuning hundreds of models, in a given quarter, that becomes something where investment and tooling may be a very practical idea. those efforts can go a long way, because then engineers, as they're building, are doing the work that you would otherwise be asking them to do at a later point in time. And they're doing it in a way that actually benefits their own organization as well, because junior engineers, new engineers of the company can follow their steps, learn from it, et cetera. And so it is something, though, of a challenge. I mean, the efficiency and compliance challenge, is not a new thing to privacy or to AI. It's not new, privacy is not new, and security. And it's always an effort to, find a balance between meaningful compliance, getting the boxes all checked, but also doing it in a way that doesn't interrupt the course of business.
Shoshana?
So I'm so excited by what John said, because I think it's spot on, and I think there's some fun things to tease out there, which is partly, I think you need to add some check boxes. So I want to say two things here. One is, when we're talking about engineers, right? If you're building bridges, there are certifications you maintain, there are document logs, right? DevOps is the Wild West, right? You don't need to get recertified as an ethical DevOps engineer yet. Right? And all of these basic things. So you might want to examine the extent to which your process for them includes, and of course, if it can be automated, that's great, having logs of what's happening that exist outside of the code, because the business needs access to that to understand the changes and why they took place. And then, of course, to use those efficiencies and those considerations across all of your simultaneous projects. So you have a way to do the full arc of sort of logging, evaluating, adapting, refining, and notifying. The other thing I would say is the culture piece is so important, right? Explaining to people in every aspect, and they all have to hear it a bit differently, of your organization, the extent to which being a true professional in this day and age requires not only the cyber hygiene, the attention to privacy, but the understanding that all of these other aspects of data, confidential, strategic, financial, they are all impacted too with AI, and that they need to sort of level up in professionalism around the tools that they use, staying within the confines. And the last thing there I would say that's completely free, that I advise for all organizations to consider, is really adding data protection and AI governance into your performance reviews. It costs nothing. And it means that everyone in your organization is thinking about how they performed against this when they're thinking about what they're going to get paid. And that's an important moment to have that consideration top to bottom.
Henri?
Yeah, so on our side, we actually had already an internal AI development platform that was meant to be targeted for developers and engineers. And then what we did there is that we actually extended that AI development platform with capabilities that are intended to now focus on AI governance activities. So what happens today in practice is that the teams who are using this internal platform, they get basically deployed an environment, or actually multiple environments, for them to first of all test, QA, and take it to production, an application throughout the life cycle. And in this case, we also have integrated certain guardrails by default into that development platform. So this also means that the teams making use of the platform, they will get the guardrails as a service provided to them by default. And the only thing that the teams need to do is that they need to, of course, fine-tune that for their use case, because the configuration is like one set of standard filters and standard guardrails, and it might not work for all the teams the same way as it's intended. So in the application context, the teams can also come back and they can configure and test and fine-tune those filters as they go. This has helped us to scale these guardrails basically across the whole application ecosystem landscape, because also there are teams, again, from this awareness perspective and culture perspective, who are not necessarily data scientists, because the traditional AI side now, after LLMs, it has evolved much. And what we see is that there are many engineers who are not necessarily as equipped to work with AI as the data scientists perhaps in the past were. Therefore, from this cultural problem perspective, we are addressing that with this guardrails as a service, because then we get this control protection by default. And what we are next then going to do is to also augment that guardrails with more guardrails, so that it becomes as a service of its own, that we actually maintain that service layer on top. So that has helped us to scale controls, basically.
And that last word, scale, reminds me of my next question. So one thing that is always challenging is scope. How do you decide something in scope for AI governance in a given situation in your company, maybe not the company you work for, but in general? We don't have very many global enforceable standards in this space yet. It's still fairly new. So how do you A, determine the scope, and B, explain the scope to people who have very little understanding of what governance actually means? So how I'm getting a lot of questions separately on LinkedIn as well for this particular session. Like, people want to know, how do you determine scope? So I want to ask Barbara that first.
Sure. Yeah, I think back to when we first heard about, Chat GPT exploding, and just really having to think about, how our company needed to move and react to that. And the first time that I was pulled into that, and my top priority was to build out a governance framework and to make sure that we're thinking about, what are all the requirements that would need to apply to the data. And so aside from looking at all of the usual applicable laws and regulations, we also look at what are the emerging expectations from customers as well, right? So that's also important to think about when you're building out such a framework. I think that the other piece there is about, when we talk about the guardrails and what Henri just mentioned around building the guardrails into the system, is that, we give them the ability, the developers, to move quickly, but within that set of requirements, right? So it's important to think about, can we have a sandbox for them to play in, so that they, can build in that sort of an environment. And then we have, a pre-production, and then we'll have a production environment, and thinking about that from, from end to end, where they have the ability, to move still quickly in those different spaces. And so, when you're trying to put all of those requirements together and to communicate those to the developers, not only is it great, as one of our speakers have mentioned, how you have those requirements already, baked in to your software development lifecycle, but that you're also, you're managing those expectations with the developers, so that they understand, okay, well, the requirement might have been a year and a half ago, it might have been X, but now actually we're seeing these expectations from the customers are emerging, or we're seeing that there's this another new law coming down the pike, and that you are managing their expectations around things like secondary use. Guess what, guys? You may not be able to use that data for an additional purpose that you thought that you could, 6 months ago. So I think that having those lines of communication open with developers is really important.
Henri?
Yeah, so on this point about the how to keep basically up to date, I think that to me the supply chain side is one of the more challenging ones, because what at least I would foresee is that there will be many more AI systems coming from the supply chain side that will be introduced to your organization, and then you need to also think about how to govern that interface, because it's not only about the systems that you develop, but also the systems that you make use. And then what we have done is that we have taken like a large definition. So we are using the OECD's definition for AI systems, it's the same as in the EU AI Act, across, and then applying against the governance context, both in the self-developed and in the procured context. In the procured side, there's also the additional dimension of potential solutions that you may want to also onward sell as well, because again, from the EU AI Act perspective, you may then change roles from a provider to deployer as such if you white label a solution. So again, that adds one more complexity in this end-to-end value chain. But in my mind, it's important to think about that throughout the cycle, basically, to consider it from the journey all the way up to the insourcing side to onwards licensing perspective as well.
Love the example. John, you want to take a stab at this?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it's largely been said. I will flag that taking an organization, you can kind of look at it holistically. I mean, every company has so many different constituent parts. And as we were talking about in the answer to the first question, right, of like, how do we get everybody on board for responsible AI? I think about AI governance as sort of a part of a culture of compliance. As part of that culture, there has to be some degree of self-reflection, looking across your talent organization, your engineering and development organization, all of the different organizations within the company, to see the ways in which they're developing AI or which they're using it. To Henri's point, there's a lot of AI that just comes in through company employees wanting to do something different that is powered by AI, and you have to think about that. to the broader legal landscape point, I mean, I think, everybody's been spot on, right? I mean, I kind of joke with my team that we're kind of like on this magic carpet ride. Like everything is changing in the legal landscape as quickly as it's changing in the actual AI landscape, right? Obviously that it took a while for the AI Act to come from, like the 2021, European Commission draft to where we are today. But we've quickly seen copyright laws in South Korea. We've seen Brazil has a proposal for a similar law. We've seen many United States have laws that take different components. California, for example, has a law that requires transparency around training for generative AI systems. Washington's considering a similar bill. It's changing literally every day, every week, and we have to tell teams that as we're on this compliance journey, don't get too wedded to the idea of this is exactly how things are being done. Instead, think about the broader constructs, the broader contours of what we're trying to accomplish, and recognize that there's going to be some, wiggling on the journey along the way, but we're heading in directionally the right place, and just be flexible enough to account for those changes, right? But it is a challenge though, right? Because if you're telling your engineers, look, for like the 10,000, 20,000 AI systems or models that we're building, we have to do these things. And then a new law comes along and we have 5 months to change all of these things incrementally. That's hard to do. And so there has to be some degree of flexibility and resilience built into your programs.
So I think we're down to the last minute and a half. Shoshana, want to take a stab at this?
I don't want to answer. I think it's better to pull a little bit away, follow John's thread there, which I think is really important. And I think it ties into something we discussed as a group, right? Which is like, what is the one sort of thing that's different about an AI governance program, or that you really want to look at from the start? And I will say, to John's point, for every other program you've ever built, if there are changes, it doesn't mean you made a mistake, but it means that something could evolve. Your KPIs for an AI governance program should be as such that if it was not adapted over the course of a year, you did something wrong. You don't have your finger on the pulse of some aspect of what you're supposed to be doing. The program must be inherently adaptive, not just flexible, but built to respond to all of those layers of feedback and engagement and shift. And then I'll just pull this out, which is just that Henri pointed out something really important in terms of looking at that trajectory and maybe the shift from procurement to actual vendor management, which is a more expansive piece and allows them to track the technology instead of people in each department.
On that fantastic note, thank you all so much.